Now, African Americans or Negroes or blacks or colored or Afro, I've actually been through all of those names growing up. You know, it's always nice to have someone define you and tell you what you are. But I am me. You know, that's who I am. But African Americans, and I will use that term, or blacks generally, have always had an interest in science and technology. And in fact, if you looked at many people who find themselves in disadvantaged positions, they tend to do very well in intellectual activities. And one reason is that they have essentially no choice but to engage their minds. And so what I will discuss today is going to give you a very brief period or summary of a period from about 1935 to 1945. And I call that the heroic era. And you will see why I say that in a minute. Now, I am not selling books, okay? But I do have 2 books, and if you have an interest in them, don't ask me for them. You can Google my name and buy a copy, but it is not required. The first one here is called The African American Presence in Physics. In 1999, the American Physical Society had its centennial here in Atlanta. It was formed in 1899. And as part of that celebration, I created a display. And this is just, we had some money left over. You know, we drank enough liquor, had enough food, pork chops and everything. So we said, why not have a little? And so this particular little pamphlet here, about 100 pages, is called The African American Presence in Physics. Now, for those of you who are college professors, and particularly graduate students who have very little money, this is free. If you just Google my name and put this on it, it's part of Digital Commons over at the Atlanta University Center with a library that has exactly the same name as you have, okay? In a few moments, I will give some comments on this person. The second volume here is an edited volume that I did at roughly the same time as this. Let me ask you this. How many of you know the first African-American, black, Negro, or whatever you want to call them, who got a PhD in anything? And what was that? The first African-American to get a PhD in any subject was Edward A. Boucher. He received a degree in 1876 from Yale University in physics. So let me start. I was going to put this in the chair, but I see we have academics, so somebody might steal it. I better put it over here. I mean, I know I would. So let me figure out how this thing works. Well, see, in physics, we have what's called the monkey principle. You know, if you're given a piece of equipment, what you do is you just keep pushing. Yeah, see, I pushed this, I got it on. So this is a picture of Edward A. Boucher taken about 1873 in Philadelphia. And the people that he's standing in the midst of are his classmates from Yale University. Now, can any of you determine which one is Boucher? Just for those of you who are either colorblind or everybody looks alike or whatever that, he's in the second row. Is this what do you call it? One of these things where you have a right. Well, I'm trying to figure out how to turn the laser. Is this a laser pointer? Hold, put your finger back there. Oh, okay, yes. This thing works. Anyway, that's Boucher there. I would suggest that all of you ask yourself the question, what would be the circumstances such that the first African American to get a doctorate in any subject got it near the end of the 19th century, and it was in physics. I mean, what were the forces that would lead him in that direction to get such a degree? 1876. He finished his undergraduate work in 1874. Right after the Civil War. 70, yeah. So now, one of the other issues that comes up when you discuss African American in science is that most of the northern universities had a very large component of Southerners. This includes places like Princeton, Yale, and so forth. And think about it. The tensions that must have occurred when one looks over and you see this Negro, this African American, colored person, and I won't use the word at this time, this moment, that they might have called him, you know? So one of the things that I always bring up with my students is if a person like that could succeed, and if after his graduation from both undergraduate Yale and graduate Yale, that he had colleagues, and there's a lot of documentation that's written by his classmates. And by and large, most of them enjoyed his presence and thought that he was a great fellow. So I don't have much sympathy for people who claim that is nowadays, that they have problems. Everybody has problems, you know, everybody. And so what if you have problems? You know, get over it. That's what I say, you know, yeah. So that was Boucher. And I could spend 2 or 3 hours just talking about Boucher, because when Boucher left Yale, he went to his first position for about 35 years was at the Institute for Colored Youth. How many of you have heard of the Institute for Colored Youth, which is in Philadelphia, which later on in the great battle between Du Bois and Washington moved out into the country and became Cheney. If you look at the Cheney website, they will say, we're the oldest historically black college in the country. We were established in 1835. No, the Institute for Colored Youth was established in 1835. And many of the directors of the Institute are very famous men and women that you have heard of. Now, this is Elmer Imes. Elmer Imes was the second African American to receive a degree in physics, and he did outstanding internationally recognized research in the area of physics we call infrared spectroscopy now. A close analogy to that is, how many of you have microwaves? You know, heat up your popcorn, you know, you graduate students 2 or 3 o'clock at night, no popcorn, the liquor is gone, the beer, you know. Microwaves generally, you know, most foods have water in it. And so when you turn on the microwave, what happens is that it causes the water molecules to rotate. That's why when you cook with a microwave, the food is different than if you cook in an oven. Because what a microwave does is heat up what? The water. So if you put in, let's say, a lemon meringue pie, okay, the filling will get hot, the meringue will not get hot. But his work was not constructed in microwaves, but was to deal with the general phenomena of molecules, the structure of molecules. Now, almost all the civil rights leaders, beginning back in the latter part of the 19th century, were concerned with not just science, but how the society as a whole interacted and interpreted the intellectual abilities of African Americans. And this is an article that if you get an opportunity, you should read. It's by someone you probably know, Du Bois. And this particular one appeared in the American Scholar in 1939. And he deals with the general subject as to, what he says is that, look, we clearly have a number of African Americans who are doing research, who could do even better and more significant research if they were given the opportunity to have university positions. And so that's essentially the nature of the article. Okay. Again, how many of you have heard of this article or seen this article? You folks saw it at the university, right? All righty. You should not pay any attention to what I say. But on the other hand, you have a paradox. If you pay no attention to what I say, then you won't hear what I have to say. So I'll let you figure out that paradox.
Excuse me, do you have a microphone?
Yes, I do.
Can you use it?
It's turned on.
Oh, it's turned on.
It's turned on. There's a microphone there, but I also have one here too. Okay? I will try to speak a little louder. Did you hear that? That's it. Anyway, one of the persons that can be used to illustrate the plight of African American scientists. When I say science, I'm using in the generic sense. So this includes the social sciences, though I'm a little shaky about it, but all the sciences, one of the most famous, at least African American mathematicians, was David Herold Blackwell. And I'll just give you a little brief synopsis of the interesting parts of his life. He finished his PhD in mathematics and was accepted at the Institute for Advanced Studies. This is back in the 40s. And from there, he spent a year or two at Clark College, near part of Clark, Atlanta. Then he went to Howard University for about a decade. And based on his research, he eventually became chair of the Department of Statistics at the University of Berkeley, of California at Berkeley. This is back in the 1950s. I mean, just think about that. But there's an interesting history behind that. One is he was offered a position at the University of California, Berkeley Mathematics Department. And the faculty in the department voted on him to become a member. But unfortunately, the wife of the chair of the department was from some southern state. I'm not sure which one, Mississippi, Texas, or whatever. And what she said to her husband was, I am not going to let any, is it allowed to say the N-word here? No. It's not allowed?
You can't say the word.
Well,
you cannot.
You cannot?
You cannot say the word.
Why not? I mean, why not? I mean,
leadership in Atlanta. You can't say the word.
yes, you can. I mean, I can say it right now. So that's not the issue. I mean, for example, how many of you have read the little poem by Count Cullen called Baltimore? Okay. So you're saying that a whole set of black literature cannot be repeated because somebody gets upset by the N-word? That is bullshit. Told you'd be interested. In any case, she told her husband, you cannot have this person. Now, think about this. You got a spouse that you have to come home and see every night, and you got this nice little colored person here who's internationally famous and everything. What decision are you going to make? Hope he gets a job. So But eventually what happened, and I'm leaving out a lot of the historical stuff, but eventually what happened is a new Department of Statistics was set up. And that's how he arrived at the university. And there are some other little tidbits. I mean, it did not help, I guess, in the overall scheme of things, that most of the outstanding statisticians were Jewish. So you can see there's a whole bunch of dynamics that's going on. So what happened is they set up an entirely new department. He was also the first African American to be elected to the National Academy of Sciences, you know. And in recent years, a large number of others have been. But he is a pioneer in not only the areas that are indicated here, game theory, probability, information theory, Bayesian statistics, but there are at least 6 different theorems that carry his name, sometimes with other people, okay? Now, why did I call the period from 1935 to 1945 the heroic era? There were a large number of African Americans, relatively speaking, who made outstanding contributions to science and engineering, but oftentimes within the framework of people not knowing that they were Black. So if we remember that I showed you a photo of Elmer Imes. Okay? He had this very high reputation for being a distinguished physicist. And the only position, well, when he left, and he got his degree in 1919 from the University of Michigan, and then he spent roughly the next 10 years in the New York, New Jersey area, working as an engineer. Received about 4 or 5 different patents and so forth. And by the way, how many of you know who his wife was? Nella Lawson.
Oh, wow.
Nella Lawson. We tend to think of either Nella Lawson or we tend to think of Elmer Imes, but we don't put the two things together. The Imes family was probably one of the most famous families in this country that almost no one has ever heard of. And you should look up the Imes family. Now, one of the difficulties is that the name is spelled about 20 different ways. Okay? Think about it. You pronounce it, Imes. Well, is that an E or is that an I? Okay? But Imes had a brother who was a theologian. He got a PhD. Some of his friends and colleagues included people like Du Bois, James Weldon Johnson. So it was a very well-connected, you know. This brings up an issue. When we write, who are we writing for? I mean, when you write some dynamite piece in your field, how many other people actually read that stuff? I mean, how many people actually read it? You really, most writing, most research is for a particular audience. And that audience, relative to the total population, is extremely small. Okay? Again, let's think about Boucher. You would think that every Negro, colored person, African American would know about Boucher. Forget about other folks. Almost no one, if you just walked up to someone and asked them about it, But that's not surprising, at least to me. Where would they hear about it? You take your research. Next time you go to Kroger, or if you're going over to Trader Joe's and buying some wine on Friday, and just say, next time you ask them, well, just ask them about your field. You don't have to ask them about Boucher, So when we write and we talk about we're having a major impact, what we're really dealing with are elites dealing with other elites. This is not something that is part of the general knowledge. Now, one reason why the period from 35 to 45 was important was that in the 30s, the United States, whether stated publicly or not, knew that they were going to war. And there were a lot of people who wanted to go to war. And they knew that if they went to war, there were two major countries that they would have to deal with. That's Germany and Japan. And they also knew that it's going to be difficult, and what they wanted, at least during the period that the war was being, they wanted more or less a unified country. And so they had to allow for different sorts of people to fill in jobs. I mean, and one of the big beneficiaries, at least during that period, in terms of technology and just industry in general, were women. You had, because what, the men were away, fighting. Okay? And so during this period, you had a relatively large number, relative to the previous period, of African Americans who started getting PhD degrees, particularly in physics and chemistry. And here's a list of, let's see, let me count. 4 names. Okay? You had Herman Branson, who got his degree from Cincinnati. There was a whole bunch of people who got degrees from the University of Michigan. Warren Henry was at the University of Chicago. At one time, during that period at the University of Chicago, particularly in chemistry, there were about 8 blacks who were getting degrees. Now, think about that. We're talking about back in the 30s. That's a large number of people. James Lawson was a student of Elmer Imes. Okay? And James Lawson was my professor when I was at Fisk. So in that sense, Elmer Imes is my intellectual PhD grandfather. But in the period from about 1935 to 1941, there were 4 black students at the University of Michigan in math and physics. I mean, they may not even have 4 students now. So you can see that this period, because of the impending war and because of the need for technical, I'll use the word manpower, human power, many of the previous barriers were broken down. Now, the unfortunate thing is that after the war is over, many of these folks trained other people, non-black people, to take their jobs. Well, trained them. They knew that they were being, I'll just say fired, but they were not going to remain there. And there's lots of oral histories of African Americans with both PhDs and non-PhDs who had to train people to replace them. Here's several other. Some of you in the audience are probably aware of Henry C. McBay. His wife received a PhD in mathematics, I believe, from Emory University back in the, 60s, 70s. One of the early PhDs was Hubert Thaxton. He got a PhD in nuclear physics from University of Wisconsin. You had J. Ernest Wilkins. Now, Jay still is the youngest student who has ever been admitted to the University of Chicago. He went there when he was 13, and when he was 19, he got a PhD in physics. How many of you know of J. Ernest Wilkins? Well, how many of you have seen him? J. Ernest Wilkins does not look black, but he has always been very strong in maintaining the fact that he's black. Yeah? But he finished, and he told me that he would have gotten his PhD at the age of 18, except that, he was with the girls and they took up, yeah. But the other interesting thing about J. Ernest Wilkins, remember on the previous slide, I had Warren Henry. There was, and Henry McBay. All of them were at the University of Chicago. They overlapped at the same time. Jay was 13, and these other folks were like 28, 29. Now, many of the scientists, when they finished college, had to work, and so they became principals of high school. I want to say a few words about this young lady because she finished from Fisk. Remember I said that there were these several students at the university. She was a student of Elma Imes. And she got a BS from Fisk in 38. She got an MS in physics from the University of Michigan in 41, but she taught school for a couple of years. That's why you see, it's not that it took her a long time. She had to get some money, eat, all that kind of stuff. What does it say? She worked on part of the Manhattan Project. It's called the Dayton Project. How many of you heard of the Dayton Project? What they were doing is they were doing triggers for the atomic bomb, but this is inside a city, so it was part of the Manhattan Project, but very few people know about it. And that site is still one of the most radioactive sites in the whole United States. So she worked on the project from 1943 to 1947, and then she taught several years at various historically black schools, and then she went to MIT. Okay. And she received a master's degree in accelerator physics or nuclear physics, I believe in 1952. And she died afterwards. She was basically at the point where she could finish up her PhD, but she died from acute radiation poisoning. Radiation? Yes, because they were dealing with plutonium triggers. Yeah. So why heroic? Well, all of these people, the men and the women, what I've had on my chart is just one female, but there were many more women than what I've indicated there. They were dauntless. What they said is, look, I have an interest in this area, and just because someone calls me name, just because someone says I can't do it, I don't have to pay any attention to it. That's their issue. Might have to bring out my little 22, help resolve some issues, The other quantity that they had was that they had intensity, that is, they were very well focused. They had courage, and many times courage comes from just not paying attention to what people say. A lot of times you have to ignore stuff. You can ask my wife; she ignores me all. I say stuff. That's we've been married 42 years. Y'all keep that in mind. And they were daring. So, for example, let's take the young woman when she's at the University of Michigan back in the 40s. Was that easier than it is now? Our son got his PhD from Michigan in computer science. Nowadays they got everything, Your feet hurt? Oh, we're going to bring somebody in. We can massage your feet, 2 Too cold for you? Well, let's see. We're working on a campus down in the Virgin Isles. But you get the point I'm trying to make. These people went into situations that were intrinsically difficult, and they succeeded. And most of the people during that time who got themselves in that situation, they succeeded. Because I think they had a certain mental and intellectual toughness that is not necessarily prevalent nowadays. When you think that everybody is out to get you, they are out to get you. Yeah. They were not intimidated or subdued. And by and large, most of them became outstanding and distinguished leaders in their disciplines, to the extent they didn't die before then. But so these are just some photos here of some of the people that I have mentioned. Herman Branson was president of several universities. He was chair of the physics department at Howard University. And he's also one of the people, and there's been this controversy. You've heard of Pauling, right, chemist, and the double helix. Well, he did some of the original work as a postdoc at Caltech with Linus Pauling. Now, his claim that he didn't get, but that's for someone else. Yeah. Here's a picture of Carolyn Parker. Beautiful lady, intelligent lady. The interesting thing is that almost everyone in her family either had a PhD, an MD, a degree in geology. I think one or two had masters, but all of them were highly educated. Okay? No, there's a distinction between being educated and being degreed. When you finish, you certainly are going to be degreed, and you may or you may not be educated. Two things aren't the same. You don't have to go to college or get a college degree to be educated. Now, if she had not died of acute radiation poisoning, and by the way, I've tried to get through Freedom of Information Act stuff. They basically will give no information out. And much of the details of the pollution at that site is still classified, or it's very, very hard. They just told me we have no records of it. If she had finished her PhD, she would have been the first African-American woman to get a PhD in physics. The first African-American woman to get a PhD in physics was Willie, hey, that's a good name, Willie, spelled the usual way, 2 L's, W-I-L-L-I-E, Hobbs, H-O-B-B-S, Moore, M-O-R, no, 2 O's. I always have problems with 2 O's. Anyway, and she got it from the University of Michigan. Okay? In 1972. So we're talking about basically a century between the first African-American male and the first African-American female to get an advanced degree in physics. Yeah. For a long time, people thought that Shirley Jackson was the first. All of you heard of Shirley Jackson, right? Or at least many of you have. She, Washington, D.C., PhD in theoretical physics from MIT. She's president of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. She was head of the Nuclear Regulatory Agency under Clinton, and a favorite person in Washington, D.C. Yeah. This is Jim Lawson, one of IME's direct students. And again, he, when IMES eventually returned to Fisk, and through his efforts, and Jim Lawson had returned from Michigan, they set up a research and training laboratory. And for about 2 or 3 decades, most of the people who learned the new spectroscopy and the equipment to go along with it were trained at Fisk University during the summer. That's what I did when I was a student there, you know. Perk and Elmer was the equipment company. And so they hit on to a good thing. Oh, and all those things were integrated. They were integrated. What they did is they said, look, we're coming out with this new equipment. We're going to give Fisk this equipment. And so you train people on a certain bit of equipment. So when they go back, what are they going to buy? They're going to buy, you know, yeah. And so that continued for quite a long while, okay? And this Infrared Institute actually had various sessions, summer sessions in South America. So let me just sort of finish by discussing some very general lines. Okay? Look, you folks have no questions? I am not that clear. I don't even understand what I'm saying. I mean, you have no questions. That means that, and you don't appear to be going to sleep. Are there zombies? There'll be zombies there. Anyway, but a question that which we discussed briefly earlier is that, you know, when you talk about people in a particular field, when you write biographies and autobiographies, you'll see what I mean when I say, hey, you can write somebody's autobiography. Question is, who gets talked about? Who gets written about? It's people who get written about are not necessarily the folks who have done anything. But I and a couple of folks at Clark Atlanta University in the other Woodruff Library over across the street there, about 10 miles, we're doing an essay that's entitled, Who is the First? The first is not necessarily the initial people to do anything. The first oftentimes are the people that others decide they want to be the first for a variety of reasons. So, what is the name of the Negro woman who was the first to integrate the bus down in Birmingham? We know that she was not the first. And we know why she was not the first. Because the first person was not someone that they wanted to put forth. And so firsts are always defined by generally other people who want to make some point. And the same thing goes in general with biography and autobiography. Okay? I've been writing informally over the years my biography. And on the title page I have, this story is based on life. That gives you a lot of freeway or freedom. Doesn't mean that it's true, it's just based on it, right? So I can write anything I want. I mean, you know, sometimes I go around and talk, I say, Dr. Mickens, is that true? And I say, what difference does it make? It ought to be true, you know? But a lot of history is that way. A lot of what you read, a lot of the documents are they're not about what happened. They're about what someone wants you to think happens. And they usually do it for a particular purpose. Okay, and you need to keep that in mind. Okay? One of the other things that's very important when you start looking into history, particularly in the sciences, is the concept of invisible colleges. How many of you have heard of invisible colleges? It's been around, at least in the history of science, for a while, for at least 4 or 5 decades. The idea is the following, okay? When you do research in any field, it could be history, sociology, physics, mathematics, most historians, most mathematicians, unless you just were lucky, have never heard of you. They will never hear of you. In science, for example, it's been estimated that roughly, if you're one of the leaders in your field, roughly somewhere between 50 to 100 people know about your work. And these are the people who read your proposals, who review your paper, and vice versa, right? Who give the awards out. And so this whole thing about you are a great scientist, so you're great. Most people have never heard of you, you know. But what the invisible colleges do, there are these networks that are set up. And so they determine, for example, who becomes president of an organization, let's say a large professional organization, the awards that they give out. Okay? No matter what you do in physics, the chances of winning a major award is almost zero. There's just not enough awards. And so there has to be some selection criteria. That criteria may or may not have any relevance to the actual discovery of itself. Okay? So look, for example, at, one of the universities here in the greater metropolitan area, extending 100 miles up to University of Georgia. They've recently named something after someone as being the first person to do that. So it goes back to the first person. Well, you don't know that that was the first person. In particular, among black people, you don't know. Nowadays, it's very hard to determine what that concept of blackness means. It certainly has nothing to do with skin color, though it does. If you ever look up J. Ernest Wilkins' picture and his father, you'd never, just from their, how they look. So what does first mean? Again, the first oftentimes it's a sociological, political decision that you want to make to some end which others may or may not understand. Okay? So my work, in addition to writing a whole lot of papers, and I must say though, a lot of my papers get read by the 150 people who follow me. Yes. I am not being modest when I say all that stuff you read about me is true. Well, there was a physicist named Dirac, and he was autistic. And he was called before a judge, some technical issue. And the judge asked him to raise his hand. The judge says, who is the most outstanding person in your field? And he said, I am. And the judge said, well, why do you say that? Judge, Your Honor, I have sworn to tell the truth. But this often happens, One is, look, if you don't believe in yourself, who else is going to believe in you? And besides, the quality of belief these days is very low. So, it really does help not to take these other people, even when they say you're good. Well, how would you know? Here's a little joke I like to tell people. But this actually happened. I was at the coffee shop sitting down, and I have all these old, decrepit people who, they get 80, 90 years old, my age. And so they have nothing to do but go to the coffee shop, And so there was one fellow I was talking with, and he just wasn't getting the point. So I told him, I said, it's very hard to talk about stupidity when the person that you're talking to don't understand what you mean. Good thing he didn't follow the argument. Look, if you don't enjoy what you see, one of the things, as you can see, I randomly talk, but one of the things I find among many people nowadays is they can't laugh. They can't have fun with themselves, You don't get anywhere by always being serious. That don't mean that you should not be serious sometimes, but not always. So So my work in recent years has focused, in addition to the hard research in applied math, on trying to understand issues related to just general human interactions. So, question, how do you know what you know? And, we believe a whole lot of things, I mean, there's some things that have more of an impact than others. I mean, you might say, well, I don't believe that there are trucks out on the interstate. That can be very easily solved. You can just walk out there and see what happens. And more than likely, you'll be on the 6 o'clock news. Strange person walking across the interstate, did not make it. But the more general thing, again, is how do you know, what you know? I mean, one of the purposes of college education and being in a college environment is in part to answer that. Because most of the kids that I've seen, they come, they have all kinds of ideas about what they believe and what they don't believe. And hopefully 4 years, that has been enhanced. And by enhanced, what I mean is that they have a better understanding of what should they believe versus what they want to believe.